The two forces met in the eastern Hapi River Delta at the Battle of Pelusium in 525 BC. The Persians used cats and other animals sacred to the Egyptians before their front line, allegedly to prevent the Egyptian forces from firing upon them. This is what Herodotus reported as the battle between the Persian forces and the last of the Nubio-Kemetic army met to decide the fate of the next 2,000 years. It is a perfect metaphor for the end of the ancient Egyptian civilization, one where the respect for tradition had served and sustained the civilization for 3 millennia, and in the end, it had ironically caused its downfall. This battle did not occur in the time of Cleopatra, but 2 centuries before her reign. Much has been made about the ethnicity of Cleopatra lately. In truth, when one realizes the truth of the matter, it becomes clear that her ethnicity is irrelevant. This is because by the time Cleopatra was born, it had already been centuries since the ancient Kemetyu had already left. And today we will see how the location of where the Kemetyu went after their civilization collapsed tell us everything about who they were. Anyone who plants a tree before they die hasn't lived in vain. Who can guess where that proverb is from? Before we begin, I love a good debate, but above all, I like discourse to be grounded in the truth. So, if you have an opinion to share, please make sure you review the evidence presented here first, and that you support your argument with trustable sources. Kemet deniers will often cite Cleopatra as proof to justify a European or Levantine origin of ancient Egypt. But there is a big problem with that argument. Cleopatra was born at least 300 years after the ancient Egyptian civilization had collapsed. How can you be pharaoh of a civilization that no longer exists? The best she could do was be queen of Roman territory situated in Africa. It's important to note that this battle did not happen during Cleopatra's time, but at least 5 centuries before she ruled. While there has been much discussion recently about Cleopatra's ethnicity, the facts show that her background is not the main point. By the time Cleopatra was born, it had already been centuries since the ancient Egyptians, referred to as the Kemetyu, had disappeared. Today, we will explore how the places where the Kemetyu went after their civilization collapsed can tell us a great deal about who they really were. And so began the long centuries of migration of the black Africans from their empire in ancient Egypt towards the people of their kin deep in the continent of Africa. And they took along with them all the hallmarks of their civilizations. But we will also see the scholarly evidence that shows their migration back into the continent. It also shows that the ancient Egyptians are literally the same people that we see in sub-Saharan Africa today, and to show you that the ancient Egyptians migrated back to the people of their own likeness in Africa, we will do so by demonstrating and reviewing research on the following. Number 1. Ancient Egypt was a black African civilization from its early days to its end in 343 BC. Number 2. Before ancient Egypt started to be the great civilization that we know today, all its elements existed, not in Europe, not in the Levant, but in black Africa. Number 3. Then we will review evidence showing that the ancient Egyptians were of the same stock as infra-Sahara Africans today. Number 4. Finally, we will show that they migrated back to Africa from where they came. But let's start first with the DNA evidence that shows that the people that were in ancient Egypt are the same ones that we find all over black Africa today. At the end of the video, we will also read you revealing extracts from a dissertation by Shomer Takeda and Jean-Philippe Gourdin, which illustrate how dishonest many of the studies on ancient Egypt have been. And these are the same studies that have been used by Kemet deniers. You can use the chapter guide to skip ahead, or you can stick around for the genetic analysis that demonstrates where the people of ancient Kemi went. This video is a collaboration between Camjivers and Without History. Check his channel out. After the fall of ancient Kemet, Egypt, and later the collapse of Meroe in Nubia, waves of migration set in motion that reshaped Africa's political and cultural landscape. New states emerged as descendants of the ancient Nile Valley peoples moved deeper into Africa. For instance, the Kara dynasty established the Wangara Inter-Empire at Kanem, from which centers of power sprang up along major waterways. Tajara along the Hapi River, Zagara near Lake Chad, and Ngalam by the Oya and Senegal River valleys in Western Africa. Genetic studies have revealed markers, such as specific Y chromosome subclades, that link modern populations like the Yoruba, Igbo, and Fulani back to the ancient Nile Valley. These markers, including the evolution of subclade EFT321625 from the first dynasty of Kemet into EY161140 found in Cameroon, support the idea that as environmental changes, like the drying of the Sahara, and foreign invasions disrupted life in Egypt, many descendants of the Kemetyu migrated into what we now call sub-Saharan Africa. Historical records and oral traditions, such as the Agala's list of 82 rulers and Yoruba stories tied to the great Wangara General Modi Sop, further confirm that these migrations were both widespread and long-lasting. Paleopathological research adds another layer to our understanding of these movements. Studies on ancient human parasites, particularly schistosomiasis, show that people once traveled from the Great Lakes region into ancient Kemet and later into West and Central Africa. The presence of parasite infections in skeletal remains acts as a biological marker, linking disease evidence with historical migrations. In related research, Dr. Jean-Philippe Gourdin has examined ancient strains of tuberculosis and leprosy and tracked the expansion of sickle cell traits from sub-Saharan Africa to the Nile Delta as early as 7300 BCE. His work demonstrates how human migrations influenced not only cultural landscapes, but also the spread of genetic traits and diseases. In other studies, the Kemetyu skeletal remains have been shown to have been heavily afflicted by sickle cell anemia. This is interesting because this sickle cell disease is in fact an adaptation specific to Black African population that deforms the red blood cells, on the one hand, but confers superior resistance against malaria on the other hand. This mutation is virtually non-existent in other non-Black populations, so we should ask, how is it that the Kemetyu weren't Black, but carried all these pathological markers that are associated with Black Africans, and that perfectly track their migration from the interior of the continent to ancient Egypt and then back into West and Central Africa? That is because the simplest answer to all this is that the people of the Nubio-Kemetic civilization were Black and migrated back into the continent after the collapse. By the way, there are no comparable genetic or pathological findings that support a European or Levantine ownership of Kemet. All markers from both groups start to appear very late in the delta, in the north, and become meaningful in number towards the end of the ancient Egyptian civilization. But there is more telling genetic DNA that links the Kemetyu to present-day Black Africans, and by extension, African American and Black people in the diaspora. Further support comes from genetic studies on autosomal and mitochondrial DNA. Research on mitochondrial haplogroups such as L0A1B1A3, along with maternal lineages like M1 and L3F3, provides evidence of ancient human movements from East Africa into Central and West Africa. These studies, combined with Y chromosome analyses, paint a picture of deep genetic connections across the continent. For example, in Njedo Dawal by Amadou Hampate Ba, autosomal analyses and craniometric data link the Fulani people to Ari-Omotic speakers and ancient Nile Valley cultures, supporting the theory of waterway migration from the Hapi River to the Joliba River Valley. Dr. Dieudonné Toukam's research on genetic subclades, such as EM2 and EY230129, among grassfields populations, including the Bamileke, Igbo, Yoruba, and Fula, validates the idea of a common origin. These genetic markers underscore that ancient migration events have left a lasting imprint on the genetic heritage shared by many sub-Saharan Africans today. Oh, BTW, did you know that the EM2 haplogroup, also known as E1B1A, is prevalent in ancient Kemet? And guess what the map of the EM2 haplogroup looks like? Well, it looks like this. It is a perfect overlay of Black and Afro-descendant populations everywhere, including Afro-American populations. Scientists estimate that EM2 emerged 18,000 years ago in West and Central Africa and is an excellent marker for Black African population below the Sahara. So again, we ask ourselves, why were the ancient Egyptians doing with the EM2 gene in their genome? Did they miraculously have EM2 DNA but happen to be European or Levantine? The answer is clearly no. They had the EM2 gene because they are of the same stock as Black population today, from Los Angeles to Haiti and Somalia. Researchers like Taharka Ade and Diolde Laya have emphasized the importance of combining written records with carefully collected oral histories to accurately reconstruct African history. New models, such as the Mulongi model developed by Dr. Dika Akwa, use spatial and chronological analysis to validate these oral narratives. Together, these methodologies help explain how the collapse of ancient Kemetic civilization set off a series of migrations that not only transformed political formations, but also established deep genetic and cultural links between ancient Egyptians and sub-Saharan Africans. In summary, the integrated evidence, from paleopathological markers in ancient skeletons and genetic subclade analyses to historical records and oral traditions, demonstrates that the ancient Egyptians and their descendants migrated into sub-Saharan Africa. Today, the genetic and cultural affinities between groups such as the Yoruba, Igbo, Fulani, and others bear witness to these ancient migrations, revealing a shared heritage that connects the people of the Nile Valley with those across sub-Saharan Africa. So who was Cleopatra really, and why is she important when we talk about the fall of Kemet? She lived about 500 years after Pelusium. She did not rule ancient Egypt at all. Instead, Cleopatra, 51 to 30 BC, was a queen of the Ptolemaic kingdom, a Greek dynasty that governed Egypt in the Hellenistic and Roman eras. Cleopatra was ethnically Macedonian Greek, not of the same stock of those who ruled ancient Egypt for millennia. And we will show how the research proves this. And she reigned as a client monarch under the shadow of Rome. By Cleopatra's time, the great civilization of the pharaohs had long ended and transformed under Persian, Greek, and eventually Roman control. In fact, Cleopatra was the last Hellenistic pharaoh. After her death, Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. Thus, while Cleopatra is often romantically associated with ancient Egypt, she actually ruled Roman Egypt, centuries after Kemet's golden age had faded. Long before its fall, Kemet's rise was deeply rooted in Africa's peoples and environments. The builders of ancient Egypt, the Kemetyu, the people of Kemet, were black Africans whose ancestors came from deeper within the African continent, especially from Nubia, the region south of Egypt in today's Sudan, and the Saharan interior. Even the ancient Egyptians themselves seemed aware of a southern origin. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus recorded that, according to the Nubians, the Egyptians are colonists sent out by the Ethiopians, Nubians, Osiris having been the leader of the colony. In other words, an ancient tradition held that Egypt was originally a colony of Nubia, led by the deity king Osiris. While Osiris is mythical, this story highlights a belief in a southern African origin for Egyptian civilization. Oh, by the way, this is what the early renditions of the god Osiris looked like. This is from the early kingdom era. At this point, you must be asking yourself, if the ancient Egyptian civilization wasn't black, why then would they have their chief deity as an unmistakably black man? Well, this is in line with the rest of the evidence you will see today. Modern research clearly shows this African origin. Archaeologists note that between roughly 5000 and 3500 BC, the Sahara Desert, which had once been green and habitable, began to dry out. As the climate changed, people who had lived in what is now the desert migrated toward the Nile Valley, where water and fertile soil were still abundant. These migrants were indigenous African peoples, bringing with them pastoral and farming practices. Over time, their communities along the Nile grew and gave rise to the earliest Egyptian kingdoms. Dr. Catherine Bard, a leading Egyptologist, affirms that the ancient Egyptians were indigenous to the Nile Valley, essentially an African people, and an African people that came South and Central African before they migrated to the region. They then migrated, en masse, back to the interior of the continent when their civilization collapsed. In other words, they were native Africans, not outsiders from Europe or the Near East, and they cannot be neatly categorized by modern racial labels. Crucially, southern Egypt and northern Sudan, Nubia, formed a continuous cultural zone. Archaeological discoveries show that Nubia, Ta Seti, may have had kings and symbols of authority even before Egypt's first pharaohs. For example, excavations at the ancient Nubian city of Kustul uncovered an incense burner with royal symbols resembling the white crown of Upper Egypt, dating to a time slightly earlier than Egypt's first dynasty. Did you catch that? This means that before there, where Pharaoh in the Delta, in Lower Egypt, the area we call Nubia today, already had pharaohs who were wearing the symbol of Kemetic rule, the white crown, and this is well before Narmer united Egypt. So by now you are starting to see that the people came from the interior of the continent, their gods came from the south, and their most important cultural practices came the south, deep within infra-Saharan Africa. Some historians now call ancient Nubia the ancestor of ancient Egypt, noting that Egypt likely inherited its pharaonic system, the concept of divine kingship, royal regalia, and other traditions, from the Nubians. This suggests that the founders of pharaonic civilization were black Africans from Nubia and the southern Sahara, who moved north and birthed the Egyptian state. As biological anthropologist Dr. Shamarka, S.O.Y., Keita explains, multiple lines of evidence, archaeology, linguistics, physical anthropology, show that ancient Egyptians emerged in the Saharo-Nilotic region of northeast Africa. They were essentially a local Nile Valley people whose roots lay in the Sahara and more southerly areas of Africa. Even as Egyptian society grew and absorbed some foreign influences over millennia, Keita notes that the core population remained primarily a variety of indigenous northeast Africans from the areas of the desiccating Sahara and the more southerly areas, and the original Nilotic Saharan ethnic identity did not change. And as we have seen, ancient Sahara was clearly a black African civilization. From genetic to wall painting reliefs to mummies found in today's Libya dating back to 1,000 years before Egypt started their mummification process. All of it pure black African. In sum, Kemet was born from quintessentially African soil and black African people. So, you must be wondering, if the ancient Egyptians were black, where did they go? And we will see what the research has to say about this. Because ancient Egypt was fundamentally an African civilization, it is not surprising that cultural echoes of Kemet can be found throughout modern Africa. Scholars and researchers have identified many similarities in language, religion, and customs between ancient Egyptians and various African ethnic groups, suggesting an enduring legacy. In the mid-20th century, Senegalese historian Cheikh Anta Diop argued that there is a shared cultural continuity across African peoples, from the Nile Valley to West Africa. He pointed out that despite Africa's diversity, certain core elements, such as matriarchal tendencies in society, totemic clans, spiritual concepts, and even linguistic affinities, link the ancient Egyptians with other Africans. Diop famously showed comparisons between words in Wolof, a West African language of Senegal, Diop's mother tongue, and ancient Egyptian words, finding common roots that hint at an ancient connection. For example, the Wolof word for lion and the ancient Egyptian word are strikingly similar, among many other examples Diop provided in his research. These linguistic parallels suggest that the Egyptian language was part of the broader Afro-Asiatic language family with deep African ties, and that migrating African peoples carried elements of the Egyptian tongue westward over time. Diop also emphasized spiritual and cultural parallels, arguing that the religious practices of Egypt, such as the veneration of ancestors and the concept of a soul's journey after death, have counterparts in many African traditional religions. This led Diop to conclude that ancient Egypt was a black African civilization and that later African societies inherited many of its ideas. Around the same time, Nigerian scholar Dr. J. Olumide Lucas explored connections between ancient Egyptian religion and the Yoruba religion of West Africa. In a 1948 study, Lucas documented similarities in ritual practices, deities, and language between ancient Egypt and the Yoruba people of Nigeria. For instance, both cultures revered a supreme god, Amen-Ra for Egypt, Olodumare for the Yoruba, along with a pantheon of lesser deities or nature spirits. Lucas noted linguistic links as well. Certain Yoruba words and names of gods appeared to have Egyptian counterparts. He argued that these commonalities were far too numerous to be coincidence, suggesting that the Yoruba's ancestors might have had ancient Egyptian influence or even descent. In Yoruba oral tradition, there is indeed a legend that backs this up. It teaches that the Yoruba's earliest ancestors migrated from the east, often interpreted as egyptcielo.org.za. This legend of an origin in Egypt is shared by other West African peoples as well. Early West African historians like Samuel Johnson and Dr. Lucas himself believed that Egyptians migrated into West Africa in ancient times, bringing elements of their civilization with them, scielo.org.za. While some scholars debate the timing of these migrations, the very presence of such oral histories and cultural similarities indicates a real connection. Beyond the Yoruba, Many African societies show possible links to Kemet. The practice of divine kingship, for example, was central in Egypt. Pharaohs were considered gods on earth, and this concept also appeared in kingdoms further south, such as in Nubia, where rulers were often depicted with the same regalia as Egyptian pharaohs, and later in West African states like Benin and Mali, where kings were seen as sacred. Symbols like the serpent uraeus, cobra, which Egyptians used to crown their kings, also feature in other African royal traditions. Even the distinctive styles of dress, hair, and physical depiction in ancient Egyptian art, braided wigs, headrests, certain jewelry types, can be seen echoed in some traditional styles among East and West African communities. These common traits support Diop's idea that there was a general African cultural unity, with Egypt as one important part of a larger tapestry. If ancient Egyptians and their culture were connected to the rest of Africa, what happened to these people when Kemet fell? The answer lies in a combination of historical invasions and migrations. After the Battle of Pelusium and the subsequent foreign dominations, many of the native people of Egypt migrated southward or westward into Africa, carrying their knowledge and traditions with them. Repeated foreign invasions created waves of refugees and resettlement. First, the Assyrians attacked in Tuge 7th century BC, then the Persians in 525 BC, followed by the Greeks under Alexander the Great in 332 BC, and finally the Romans in 30 BC. Each conquest disrupted Egyptian society. Temples were destroyed or repurposed, traditional institutions were dismantled, and some Egyptians, especially the priesthood and nobility who clung to the old ways, fled to safer regions, not under foreign control. Egyptologist Dr. David O'Connor has noted that the spread of Egyptian people and influence into Black Africa during and after these tumultuous periods is a genuine historical question. He describes ancient Egypt as part of a larger mosaic of African cultures and asks whether significant contact or migration occurred between Egypt and the rest of Africa. The evidence suggests that it did. As Egypt's political power waned, Nubia to the south became a refuge and successor. Egyptian priests and craftsmen are known to have traveled to Nubia, the kingdom of Kush, during Persian and later Greek rule, where pharaonic traditions lived on. In Kushite Nubia, kings continued to build pyramids and worship Egyptian gods for centuries, preserving Kemet's legacy on African soil. This shows a direct migration of culture, and likely people, into the Upper Nile region. From Nubia, the influence spread farther. Over the following centuries, 500 BC through the early AD era, populations moved out of the Nile Valley into sub-Saharan Africa. Environmental changes may have played a role once again. As desertification continued and the climate fluctuated, the Sahel, the belt of grassland south of the Sahara, became the new frontier for resettlement. Archaeology indicates that large areas of West Africa, such as the Niger River Basin, saw a significant influx of people starting around 1000 BC to 500 BC, aligning with the period of Egypt's decline. In fact, one linguistic theory, proposed by linguist Joseph Greenberg and others, posits that the Niger-Congo language family, which today covers West, Central, and much of southern Africa, might have a homeland in the Upper Nile or Central Sudan region. According to this view, people speaking Niger-Congo languages, ancestors of many West Africans, gradually migrated westward from the Nile Valley, eventually populating areas like Nigeria, Mali, and Congo. This is supported by archaeological evidence that shows the Niger Basin, West Africa, only became heavily populated in the last few thousand years. In other words, many West Africans' forefathers could have originally come from the east. Genetic research adds compelling evidence to these migration patterns. Studies of DNA in modern African populations have identified genetic lineages that seem to trace back to the ancient Nile Valley. For example, the Fulani people of West Africa have puzzled researchers for years. Culturally, Fulani are West African. They speak a Niger-Congo language, Fulfulde, but genetically they show some links to Northeast Africa. Geneticists have found that some Fulani carry Y chromosome haplogroup EM35, also known as E1B1b, a DNA marker most common in peoples from Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt. This same marker is rarer in West Africa, except among groups like the Fulani and a few others, suggesting a historical movement of people from the Nile region into West Africa. Additionally, the Fulani language itself has peculiarities that led some linguists, like P. Welmers, to argue that its roots lie in the Nile Valley rather than West Africa. Combined with archaeology, these clues paint a picture of an African diaspora from Kemet. As the Egyptian civilization declined, some of its descendants moved away, west along the Sahel and deep into the continent. Indeed, researchers have concluded that the presence of certain genetic haplotypes in West and Central Africa is an indicator for the earlier presence of speakers of Niger-Congo in an original Nile Valley homeland. Oral traditions across Africa echo these scientific findings. We noted the Yoruba legend of an origin in Egypt. Similarly, other groups have stories of coming from a faraway eastern or northern land. In parts of Mali and Guinea, legends claim that ancestors came from Meroe or Ham, terms linked to Sudan, Egypt. The Hausa people of Nigeria have a legend of migrating from the east, though in their case it's often tied to the Middle East. While not every legend is historically accurate, the recurring theme of origins in the Nile or Northeast Africa points to a real memory of ancient migrations. These migrants would have carried aspects of Egyptian Kushite culture with them, explaining why, for example, the concept of pyramidal tombs appears in places like Sudan and even as far west as northern Nigeria, where certain ancient burial mounds resemble small pyramids, or why African rulers from the Sudan to West Africa so often claim titles like Son of the Sun, akin to the Egyptian Ra tradition. When ancient Egypt, Kemet, fell at Pelusium and later became a province of foreign empires, it did not simply vanish. Its people and culture continued to live on throughout Africa. Cleopatra's death may have ended pharaonic rule on Egyptian soil, but by then the original Kemetic people had already begun a new chapter of their history across the continent. They and their relatives, such as the Nubians, moved south and west, becoming the ancestors of many African peoples of today. The civilizations they built after Kemet's fall, in the Sudanese Nile, Kush and Meroe, in the highlands of Ethiopia, along the Niger River, and beyond, carried genetic, linguistic, and cultural threads that originated in ancient Egypt. Modern scholarship and indigenous African perspectives come together to affirm this narrative. Dr. Shomarka Keita's research grounds Egypt firmly in Africa, showing its people came from the Sahara and tropical Africa. Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop highlighted the cultural unity linking Egypt with the rest of Black Africa and argued that after invasions, Egyptians migrated into inner Africa. Dr. Olamide Lucas and others found tangible connections between Egyptian and West African religious practices. Even an ancient writer like Diodorus relayed the Nubian belief that Egypt was a child of inner Africa. All this evidence, archaeological finds, DNA analysis, linguistic studies, oral history, forms a consistent story. Ancient Egypt was an African civilization whose legacy was carried forward by African descendants. For a high school reader, the key takeaway is this: ancient Egypt, Kemet, did not disappear. It transformed. The fall of pharaonic Egypt under foreign conquest was not the end of the people who built it. Those people were Black Africans, and their descendants flowed back into the heart of Africa, contributing to new societies. The cultural and biological heritage of the pharaohs can be found in Africans from the Nile Valley to West and South Africa. From the pyramids of Meroe in Sudan, to the spiritual traditions of the Yoruba, to the genetic lineages carried by millions of Africans today, the influence of Kemet endures. Ancient Egypt's story is therefore not just a tale of mummies and monuments lost to time, but also a living legacy woven into the fabric of Africa's diverse civilizations. In an excellent exposé, Shomarka Keita and Jean-Philippe Gourdin dismantle the lies and the tactics used to talk about a fake Egypt. We will read you a passage from their paper. Really outstanding how they highlight how African history has been usurped. 1. Sampling and methodological strategy. The samples can be questioned as to their representativeness of Egypt in terms of size, spatio-temporal, and socio-cultural aspects. All of the samples are from the northern half of Egypt, from one nome which is 2.4%, 142, of AE nomes. Ancient Egyptian culture originated southern Upper Egypt. The socio-cultural dynamics are not fully considered. The information on the origin and social status is incomplete, or unknowable in fact. The mummies are clearly assumed to be representative of the local population based on an incomplete archaeological report, In spite of the historical information provided about northern Egypt's interaction with the Near East since the pre-dynastic, and the known settlements of Greeks and others in northern Egypt in later periods. The timeline is not representative of AE history. 3,000 years is missing, e.g., pre-dynastic, early dynastic, Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom. The samples cannot be convincingly said to represent true breeding populations or those that truly integrate historical information. The authors use Bayesian reconstruction of population size changes through time with beast, for which there is generally a discrepancy between the marginal prior and the original prior distribution. The available information on the comparison between original and marginal priors and on prior and posterior distributions does not consider possible population substructure. Sex-biased sampling, mtDNA, cannot recover population demography of the whole country unless the sample size is large enough and representative in terms of chronology, regional variation, ethnicities, including the foreign presence, class, and geography. It suffers from many biases that can affect the assessment of the effective population size changes, mutation bias, and natural selection. The whole genome sample size is too small, N/3, to accurately permit a discussion of all Egyptian population history from north to south,